So it's 9:02, and as I said, we were going to give it a couple of minutes. So we're going to just start, and hopefully the people will continue joining. We already have around 100 people participating. Okay, so dear friends, my name is Loreto Leighton, Executive Director of the Chile Pacific Foundation, which is co-hosting this webinar in partnership with the Inter-American Dialogue, with which is always a great honor to team up. I want to especially express my gratitude to Margaret Myers, one of our speakers today and Director of the Asia and Latin American Program at the Inter-American Dialogue, who has always been open to carrying out joint initiatives around several of the most crucial topics of our time. I will also be the moderator of today's event. Please remember there is English, Spanish, Spanish-English interpretation service available for this activity. If you wish to turn it on, you just need to check on the world icon on the bottom of your screen and select the language you need interpretation for. Today's topic, Decoding China's COVID-19 diplomacy, what effects in US, China, Latin America, is certainly one of the hottest current subjects when it comes to grasping major trends shaping up geopolitics. It has been a highly discussed issue in Chile, several other Latin American countries, and the US, which in turn was the reason we thought it was time to analyze the matter in depth. At the Chile Pacific Foundation, we strive to encourage and support Chile's steps to project towards the strategic Asia-Pacific region, which obviously requires a comprehensive understanding of the global conditions impacting international relations. This said, I am honored to introduce the speakers of today's event. We have Margaret Myers. As I said, she's the director of the Asia and Latin American program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She established the Dialogue's China and Latin America Working Group in 2011 to examine China's growing presence in Latin America and the Caribbean. Margaret also developed the China Latin American Finance Database, the only publicly available source of empirical data on Chinese state lending in Latin America in cooperation with Global China Initiative at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. Before arriving at the Dialogue, Margaret worked as a Latin American analyst and as a China analyst for the US Department of Defense. She also worked as a senior China analyst for Science Applications International Corporation and as a consultant for the Inter-American Dialogue, the Inter-American Development Bank, sorry for that, and as a faculty member at Georgetown University. Then we have today with us Sergio Bitar, who is a member and non-resident senior fellow at Inter-American Dialogue, Vice President of the Board of Advisors of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, in Stockholm, and President of the Consejo Chileno de Prospectiva y Estrategia in Chile. At the Dialogue, Sergio directs the Global Trends and Future Scenarios project. He was a visiting fellow at the Harvard Institute for International Development from 1974 to 1976, a visiting fellow at the Smithsonian Institution's Latin American program from 1982 to 1983. He was elected president of the Chilean political party, the Party for Democracy, in 3 occasions, and served as a senator from 1994 to 2002. In addition, he served as Minister of Education under President Ricardo Lagos and Minister of Public Works under President Michelle Bachelet. Last but not least, Michael Stott is the Latin American editor of the Financial Times based in London. He was previously in Tokyo as managing editor of the Nikkei Asian Review, a sister publication covering Asian business and politics. Prior to that, he was the Financial Times UK's new editor. Michael reported from Latin America between 1990 and 1998, living in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Formerly Moscow Bureau Chief and Editor, Europe, Middle East, and Africa at Reuters, he joined the Financial Times in 2014. He graduated from Cambridge University with an MA in Modern Languages and speaks fluent Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, and Russian. having presented our panelists today, I'm going to turn now the floor over to Margaret so you can make your presentation.
Thank you so much, Loreto, and for the very kind introduction. And good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session today. It is indeed a topic of interest to many across the entire hemisphere, and so we're thrilled to be able to debate this topic in some depth today. It's a pleasure also for me to welcome our esteemed panelists and participants on behalf of the Inter-American Dialogue, which, as Loreto mentioned, is co-hosting this event. It's always a pleasure to work with La Fundación Chilena del Pacífico to feature commentary on topics of interest to Chile, of course, but also to the broader Latin American region and indeed to the US and Canada. What I hope to do very briefly today is to just provide maybe 4 or 5 observations about the nature of Chinese COVID-19 related engagement over the past year that are derived from a report that the Inter-American Dialogue and the Florida International University will be publishing in just about 2 weeks. So my brief presentation today will be something of a preview of that report, though I promise there's much more in there than what I'll be able to convey today. And so I hope you'll have the opportunity to take a look at that when it's published in just a bit. So a sort of first observation, and this probably comes as no surprise to those of you in the region, is that China's pandemic-related engagement with Latin America began around February 2020, and it started with the sale and donation of medical equipment of various sorts, certainly, but also with a quite interesting messaging campaign carried out by Chinese embassies and Chinese media outlets. And we've been really interested in sort of the nature of this messaging campaign. And so we used what's called Twitter mining, a Twitter mining approach, to analyze the messaging coming out of Chinese embassies over the past year, essentially from March 2020 to March 2021. And we identified a few interesting developments. The first was an increase in assertive messaging, right, in the early months of the pandemic, characteristic of the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy, right, that is featured prominently in recent academic and policy accounts of China's external communications. And for those who aren't familiar with the term wolf warrior diplomacy, it's used to describe a more assertive or defensive posture evident in China's external communications, which is really sort of a departure from what we've seen in the past as concerns Chinese outreach, right, or at least messaging in the region. We found that this more defensive messaging, which is often carried out by Chinese embassies, right, was very reactive in nature, right, really only popping up when China determined that a particular comment or a piece of analysis was especially damaging to China's image, or else contradicted China's own messaging on sensitive issues. For example, regarding the effectiveness, China's effectiveness in managing the Wuhan, outbreak or other sort of pandemic-related commentary. When this happened, right, ambassadors or other embassy staff typically took to Twitter to contradict this commentary, and a number of Latin American public figures, including Mario Vargas Llosa, Mexican actress Carmen Salinas, right, Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of the president, were sort of targeted or addressed through these campaigns. These all operated in broad support of China's diplomatic objectives, right? But were nevertheless, it was a very, very different tone, right, than what we had seen previously. Another interesting finding was that China's wolf warrior type messaging was in most cases accompanied by a proportional amount of promotional, right, messaging from China, positive messaging, emphasizing China's contributions to the region amid the pandemic. So we saw Chinese embassies really trying to balance more aggressive narratives with exceedingly positive ones. What's also of interest is that, really most of this wolf warrior type diplomacy, which again has, this term has surfaced quite extensively in the midst of the pandemic, happened really in the first, I would say 4 or 5 months of the pandemic or of its of its presence in the Latin American region, and has really diminished quite considerably in more recent months. Whether because China has deemed this approach ineffective as one possibility, or because perhaps there isn't as much condemnation essentially of China's approach to the pandemic from public figures across the region. It's unclear to me, but certainly this particular more assertive approach has been sort of on the decline in recent months. A second point I would say is there is definitely a humanitarian component, right, to China's COVID-19 aid. And I think we can see this with some certainty, given that in the early stages of the pandemic, at least, China gave more equipment to those countries that were hardest hit by the pandemic. Francisco Ordines, who's based there in Santiago, found this to be true in a study he did for the Carnegie Endowment. But in addition to humanitarian motivations, China is also using this outreach to, of course, shape views of China, which was extremely important to China, especially in the early months of the pandemic, and also to reinforce and strengthen bilateral ties, whether in support of commercial objectives or policy interests. And there are a lot of examples here, right, that one could point to, but this is most obvious as concerns China's Taiwan-related interests in the region. China has sought, for instance, to affect Taiwan's relations with Paraguay and Guyana, right, by conditioning the transfer of vaccines on changes in those countries' Taiwan policies. Paraguay was asked to cut ties with Taiwan in exchange for vaccines, and Guyana was asked to close a Taiwan commercial office. And so this, in my view at least, marks a very clearer than ever, departure from China's policy of non-interference in Latin America and the Caribbean, which has, of course, been a hallmark of its foreign policy in recent, for many decades, for that matter. A third observation, and again, not a huge surprise here, right, is that China's initial COVID-related engagement differed quite considerably from that of the United States and other donor nations, right? When you add everything up, US donations, though, sort of vaccines aside, of course, right, have been far more extensive in terms of monetary value. But much of what the US has given the region was delivered in lump sum contributions to national governments and through formal government channels. China's approach was very different. It involved mostly decentralized, right, but still loosely coordinated engagement by really wide-ranging Chinese actors, whether Chinese embassies, right, companies, provincial government authorities, networks of overseas Chinese, or quasi-governmental organizations such as the Chinese Red Cross. These all operated, right, in broad support of China's diplomatic objectives, but engaged the region at different levels of government. Central government, sort of national governments at the provincial level or state level, and even at the municipal level, and even targeting sometimes specific communities or individuals, right? There were reports of packets of personal protective equipment being delivered directly to customs officials in certain countries in the region, for example. I think, the jury is still out on whether this, China's approach is a more effective approach to aid in times of crisis, whether in terms of shaping views of China, which is a big part of this, certainly, right? Or more importantly, helping the region to manage the pandemic. But these differences are certainly striking, right? There are also, of course, clear discrepancies in US and Chinese provision of vaccines to the region, whether we're talking sales or donations. And I, very much hope the US government will be able to address those with some urgency in the coming months. And finally, there's no really conclusive understanding of the effects of Chinese engagement, to date in a range of different ways. But I'd like to, whether it be, contributions or sales or messaging that we're talking about. But I want to offer just a few quick thoughts on the effectiveness of China's outreach, whether on public opinion of China or on the region's ability to navigate the pandemic. Right? It is my belief that China's COVID-19 outreach will do much to strengthen Chinese ties to the region, whether at the firm level or the bilateral one. On public opinion, we've found very little to suggest that China's outreach has considerably improved public opinion on China in the region, which is on average split, right? At least according to 2019 survey data, with about half the region viewing China positively and about half viewing it negatively. What we did find, though, again, by mining tweets with geotags, right, suggesting that they are indeed coming from the Latin American region, is that over the past year, China was mentioned about twice as often during the COVID crisis, as it was in the year preceding COVID. So China now factors much more prominently in Latin American sort of discourse or discussion on social media platforms than ever before. The rhetoric used in these tweets was also much more emotionally charged, right? Whether positively or negatively, reflecting more intense views of China in either direction. And I suppose we'll see how and if that has any real effect on the nature of Chinese engagement with the region in the coming months and years. But certainly it's, again, an interesting development and one sort of noting as the China-Latin American relationship sort of, expands or not, right, in the next sort of phase, ideally post-pandemic. I haven't talked at all about Chinese sort of economic engagement during this, during the COVID-19 crisis, which is yet another feature of its outreach, and I'm happy to do that. But I'll leave it there to leave sufficient time for the other speakers, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you, Loret.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you for that putting out the theme that we are discussing today very clearly and challenging for the Q&A session. So you have the floor now. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm very honored to be invited by you by Inter-American Dialogue, which is in some ways my own house and the foundation. And I'm pleased to share with Margaret and with Loreto and also with Michael Stott. Good morning to everyone. I've been told that I can use any language, so I will proceed with Spanish. It's not a problem for you. Mi exposición en estos 10 minutos va a centrarse en 3 puntos. Primero, la evolución de las relaciones políticas y económicas con China recientes y los efectos de la pandemia. Luego quiero decir un par de palabras sobre los escenarios globales, las estrategias de China, Estados Unidos y otros actores, la Unión Europea y no estatales, y cómo nos puede condicionar yendo más allá de la pandemia, post-pandemia. Y tercero, ¿qué oportunidades hay para América Latina y Chile? ¿Y cuáles son los riesgos? Que creo que es una de las preocupaciones de cómo debemos proceder en los próximos 5 años. Sobre lo primero, creo que Margaret ha hecho una exposición bastante exhaustiva sobre el tema del impacto de la pandemia. En todo caso, quiero decir que, por lo menos en relación a Chile, ha sido visto como un apoyo que no se puede desconocer, que ha sido muy relevante. Chile ha logrado ya más del 50% con doble vacuna, esencialmente de China, ha provocado tranquilidad política. ¿Hay algún temor? No lo veo. Solo las informaciones sobre el origen del virus y la desconfianza que eso puede generar. Pero también se ha dado un paso adicional importante, y es el acuerdo con la Universidad Católica para producir o para investigar cómo hacer vacunas en Chile. Lo mismo la Universidad de Chile está haciendo otro tanto, de manera que va más allá que la simple venta de dosis, sino la fabricación, que es un desarrollo importante porque la pandemia ha demostrado que toda América Latina se ha quedado sin capacidad de producir bienes muy esenciales. Por ejemplo, en Chile hoy día, les doy como ejemplo, hay un problema serio de abastecimiento de materiales de construcción. cuando se detecta que no hay clavos, no hay nails en Chile, porque el grueso se trae importado, solo una planta en Calam lo elabora. Entonces se demuestra de que aquí hay problemas serios y hay que desarrollar también la capacidad productiva. Margaret me envió el trabajo de Urdines, que yo lo encuentro bastante interesante, pero de las conclusiones que saco, como él mismo dice, es un mosaico. No hay una política central china respecto de las vacunas, y en el caso de los países que tienen más inversión, China, Brasil, Chile, el grueso del aporte y apoyo ha sido por empresas, no por el gobierno central. Creo que eso también es un punto importante para pensar que esto es un fenómeno más complejo que simplemente una relación entre estados o intereses estratégicos de los estados. En todo caso, quiero también decir que hay otra mirada sobre la pandemia que es más global. Ayer hice una exposición en el diálogo Frank Fukuyama y lo que se planteaba es que hay un endurecimiento general de China con el gobierno de Xi y que eso se ha expresado porque durante la pandemia la posición ha sido más fuerte en el caso de Hong Kong, en el caso del mar del sur de China y también en las relaciones con Australia y las declaraciones durante la reunión de Alaska. Asimismo, él insistió en las redes y la influencia de las redes en la política internacional. Entonces, es una materia también que no es propiamente latinoamericana, pero que incidiría sobre América Latina, como también lo va a ser la decisión reciente del presidente Biden de avanzar en una investigación a corto plazo sobre el origen del virus. Dicho eso, yo quiero también señalar de que la relación es más larga, es más estable. Esto no va a incidir mucho, salvo en países donde claramente se reconoce este aporte. Pero la relación, por ejemplo, si tomo mi país, ha sido muy sólida y sigue siendo sólida. Basta con recordar que en el siglo XIX Chile instaló un consulado en Cantón. En diciembre del 70 el presidente Allende, del cual yo fui ministro, reconoció la República Popular China. En el año 2001, Chile apoyó a China para su ingreso en la OMC. En el año 2004, Chile fue el primer país en reconocer a China como economía de mercado y el 2005 el primero en firmar el Tratado de Libre Comercio. Me tocó estar cerca como ministro del presidente Lagos en ese periodo y de la presidenta Bachelet cuando se aprobó por el Congreso. Y en el 2018, además, también se siguieron dando pasos. En Chile se instaló el Centro de Coordinación de todos los institutos Confucio de América Latina ese año. Me tocó como ministro de Educación firmar con los chinos un acuerdo para enseñar el chino en Chile y mandar chilenos a China para estudiar. Y se instalaron ya, van 3 centros Confucio y ahora este centro latinoamericano. O sea, son relaciones largas y por eso hay que mirar la historia. Y en esas relaciones largas quiero hacer una observación. No hay hasta aquí una orientación claramente ideológica por parte de China en las relaciones por lo menos con Chile y veo también en América Latina. Durante el gobierno de Allende hubo la idea de que se alineaban ideológicamente y el apoyo fue muy menor. No tiene que ver con el tratamiento que Rusia o la URSS en ese tiempo daba a América Latina. A veces uno traslada visiones del pasado para entender lo que está ocurriendo. Y no es así. En el periodo de Pinochet, China no cortó relaciones, a diferencia de la Unión Soviética. Entonces mantuvo unas relaciones. Con la concertación y los gobiernos democráticos a partir del año 90 y hasta ahora ha habido una relación muy fluida. Yo puedo deducir de aquello de que no hay interferencia en los asuntos políticos internos, como ocurría con la Unión Soviética, y que la pujanza económica de China son 2 factores que pueden alentar una relación más estrecha de América Latina con China. Hasta hoy, por lo menos. Ahora, no hay que ser ingenuo y hay que ver de qué manera el efecto económico también se puede reflejar en influencia política que uno no quisiera desear. Pero la evolución ha sido muy potente. Si me permiten hablar de Chile, a la hora de firmar el Tratado de Libre Comercio, nosotros exportábamos cerca de 8.000 millones de dólares y el año 2020 44.000. O sea, son avances muy importantes. Ahora, dicho eso, yo creo que estamos entrando en una fase nueva de las relaciones económicas. No es solo comercio. Si uno mira la situación a partir del 2016, observa una tendencia muy fuerte de China a transnacionalizar sus propias empresas y entrar en una fase en que para la expansión económica interna china y su mercado, mantener tasas de crecimiento sobre el 5%, es indispensable la expansión internacional, no solo vender productos, estar presente a través de sus empresas. Y en ese sentido, entonces, creo que nosotros estamos viendo una presencia fuerte en América Latina en energía, en infraestructura, la vamos a ver en digital. En el caso nuestro se ha levantado un proyecto de fibra óptica por el Pacífico Sur que conecte Chile con Asia. Fuerte en el sector alimentario. En el caso del Chile el cobre no ha sido importante, pero sí el litio. Fuerte en las finanzas con la presencia del Banco de China y del Banco de la Construcción chino. Y eso representa la tendencia hasta aquí. ¿Qué viene hacia adelante? Yo creo que, me tomo un par de minutos en esto, el futuro va a depender para América Latina del orden global. Y aquí uno puede apreciar dos escenarios principales. Y hay narrativas antagónicas de parte de China y de Estados Unidos u Occidente si se forma una alianza más fuerte con la Unión Europea. En Estados Unidos se lee aquí una rivalidad estratégica tipo URSS y la política de contención. Se plantea fuerte el tema de la democracia y los derechos humanos, y también se ve como dos modelos políticos. ¿Es el autoritarismo más eficaz para resolver los problemas o es la democracia más eficaz? Y entonces, en el caso de China, la mirada es que Estados Unidos está declinando, es otra mirada, que Estados Unidos trata de contener a China y no le permite su desarrollo, y siempre traen a colación la guerra del opio y la interferencia interna, y que la democracia ha perdido eficacia para resolver los problemas de la humanidad y los problemas internos de los países. Entonces, hay posibilidad de una narrativa nueva, y qué papel puede jugar América Latina ahí. Sin duda, nosotros tenemos que observar que en el caso chino, para los latinoamericanos, hay una expansión importante, hay un desarrollo tecnológico nuevo que antes se pensaba que no era posible, pero que la relación global está basada en tres pilares en la forma que se va a establecer. Esa es mi impresión de lo que uno observa y los estudios realizados. Una rivalidad estratégica, militar, geopolítica, de sistemas políticos, una competencia económica tecnológica frente al mundo para desarrollar sus poderes relativos, y la cooperación global. Son tres. Desde el punto de vista de América Latina, lo que interesa son las dos últimas, que la competencia internacional global entre China y Estados Unidos y tecnológica sirva a América Latina y pueda optar y no tenga limitaciones para ello, y que sea toda una estrategia multilateral la que permita avanzar en esa dirección. Ahora, lo que venga hacia adelante, y termino para mantenerme en los 10 minutos que ya estamos, uno puede observar los futuros escenarios. Yo diría que sobre la base de un crecimiento chino del 5% en 2020 al 2040 como promedio, y con expansión de sus empresas, para América Latina, que enfrenta hoy con la pandemia una situación de grandes necesidades de desempleo, de inversión, de salud y de pobre digitalización y pobre desarrollo de ciencia y tecnología, China representa una oportunidad. Yo creo que va a haber fuerzas muy importantes que van a empujar para lograr esa oportunidad en la mejor forma. Ahora va a depender de la estrategia de cada país. Si no tenemos estrategia, si así como con las vacunas no hay acuerdo con una universidad para producirla y simplemente se exporta, los riesgos van a ser altos, y por lo tanto hay que compensar lo que es esta oportunidad por alguna forma de estrategia latinoamericana que hoy no se ve para sacar el máximo beneficio. Hay que tomar precauciones. Yo creo que nosotros estamos entrando en zonas más rojas en términos de una excesiva concentración de nuestras exportaciones, poco desarrollo tecnológico, mejorar las leyes. En Chile se ha hablado mucho de las empresas públicas cuando se instalan una energía eléctrica, y por lo tanto la pregunta es: ¿puede una empresa estatal de China tener una presencia dominante en un sector? Estas discusiones generan interrogantes, como lo fue la crisis con Australia, pero yo diría que está dominando en este momento como factor principal, más allá de lo que está pasando en la pandemia y como consecuencia de la pospandemia, una voluntad mayor de una relación más estrecha entre América Latina y China. Hay más cosas que quisiera decir, pero me quedo aquí por el tiempo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Sergio, for that presentation, talking more about the Latin American perspective. That was very useful and broadened the scope of this seminar relating with Latin America. So now I'll give the floor to Michael Stott. Michael, you have the floor.
Laurie, thank you so much for the kind invitation today. And thank you to the Fundación Chilena del Pacífico and to the Dialogue for organizing this seminar on what I think is a very topical theme. I'd like to frame my remarks around a few sort of broader observations made as somebody who watches the region, follows it closely, who doesn't have a dog in the fight, and who has also spent time in Asia as well as Latin America. The first I'd say to frame my remarks is that we're always a little bit in a difficult situation when we're trying to draw broader conclusions about the long-term impact of China-Latin America cooperation, vaccine diplomacy, and so on, when we're doing it at a moment in time during an unprecedented pandemic, which is still unfolding, and the effects of which are far from clear in the long term, and the narrative of which, critically, is far from clear in the long term. What do I mean by that? Well, we're at a snapshot in time. The snapshot in time today is one where Latin America is just coming out of a very bad third wave or second wave, depending on the country, which has peaked and is coming down. Vaccines are starting. And the talk is all about vaccination, all about vaccine supplies. And of course, China looks quite good in that context, right? If we just go back a moment to, say, June last year, the story was completely different. Vaccines were a dream in the distance. The talk was all about ventilators. Remember that? I mean, nobody now talks about ventilators. I can't remember the last time I heard someone talk about ventilators. But in June last year, the only thing people talked about were ventilators. It was the only thing that mattered. Now it's vaccines, right? And I think in another year or two or three, it will change again. Right now, the critical issue for Latin America is the supply of vaccines. And on that topic, the Chinese are looking good. We did some research based on the information we could find from governments, and we found that more than half of the vaccines delivered so far to Latin American governments, that's actually on the ground in country as opposed to contracts signed, were from China. And that has clearly been a win for China. But how that will be in another 6 months or a year, I think will be quite different. And it's easy to forget that when we're in the middle of this very sort of day by day, very crucial situation now. So that's the first point, the hazards of trying to draw long-term conclusions at a moment in time when the narrative is not clear. And the other panelists, I think quite rightly, mentioned the issue of the origin of the virus, which is unknown so far. It's still not conclusive. That will critically affect, I think, the long-term narrative. And in my view, will be far more important in determining the long-term narrative on the coronavirus than things like mask diplomacy, which will become a distant memory quite quickly, and possibly even vaccine diplomacy, actually, too. Because what we also know is that vaccine supplies are ramping up quickly. Production capacity for vaccines around the world is ramping up quickly. New vaccines are coming on stream all the time. And so actually, what we're likely to see in, say, 6 months or a year from now is the world being flooded with vaccines. And far from a shortage of vaccines, there will be vaccines all over the place. And there will be a choice of vaccines, which is a very different world to the one we're in now. And of course, a year out from now, the population will have mostly been vaccinated. We used some data at the FT on this, looking at the probability of the critical threshold for vaccination being reached globally. That's defined as 5 billion doses administered worldwide, which corresponds to 1 dose per adult on the planet. Obviously, that will not be like that. Some people will have had 2 doses, some will have had none, but it's a rough yardstick. Now, the data model suggests that we're using that by September or October this year, there is an 81% probability that we will have reached that 5 billion threshold. There is a 12% probability it will be reached earlier than September or October. In other words, the probability is over 90% that by October, we will have reached a global critical threshold for vaccination. And I add that just to make the point that, you know, we are rightly obsessed with vaccination now, but in a few months' time, the picture is going to start to look rather different. So I'm speaking to you today from Peru, my second point. I'm in Lima at the moment for the elections. And yesterday I was out with the leading candidate, Pedro Castillo, who's standing for Peru Libre, which is a hard left platform. I went to 2 of his rallies. I heard his speeches. I talked to his supporters. I've also been talking to business people here, people in the media, and analysts in Peru. Peru, you will all know, is one of the worst affected countries by coronavirus in the world, one of the highest death tolls, one of the most serious economic impacts. So really at the front line of the struggle against the virus. It's also a country, of course, which has been using Chinese vaccines. And I'll say a little bit more about Peru's experience on that in a moment. But the thing I thought was interesting is that so far in Lima, in the days I've been here, not one person has said one word to me about China in any context, good, bad, or otherwise. It's just not been mentioned. That's not what the debate is about here. The debate here, or about the United States, frankly, the debate here is about the government's competence in handling the pandemic, anger at corruption, anger at the high death toll, anger at the poor state of the public health system, anger at growing poverty. But those are all national issues, and those are issues on which the election's being fought. But nobody is expressing great, strong sentiment or lots of public views about China or US vaccine diplomacy. And I think, obviously, for all of us outside the region looking at it, we're very interested in those topics. They are important topics, but I think it's worth also balancing it with the fact that actually on the ground, they're not necessarily the topics that are front of mind for people in the countries. Third point, China's vaccines. Yes, they have shipped a lot of them, as I said earlier, but also it is indisputable and shown by the data and by scientific tests that China's vaccines are significantly less effective than US vaccines, and they are also less effective than the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think that's also important for shaping the narrative in the longer term. Clearly, if you're a Latin American country that really needs vaccines and you're struggling to secure supplies, you will go for what you can get. And that is what many countries have done. They've been pragmatic, they've been sensible, and they've gone for what they could get. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting what they really want to get. The CoronaVac vaccine, the Brazilian test showed, had just over 50% efficacy, which is barely above the WHO threshold for using a vaccine. The Sinopharm vaccine is a little higher at 73%, CanSino at 66%, but those numbers trail by far the figures of over 90% achieved by Pfizer and Moderna. So I would use an analogy there of the cars. If you think, you can get no car at all, or you can get a Chinese car, or you can get an American or a German car. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to take the car you can get. You'll take the Chinese car. But it doesn't mean that next year, when you have a chance to buy an American car or a German car, you're not going to take the American or the German car, get rid of the Chinese car, and just regard it as something you had to do at the time. So, I think countries are being pragmatic and sensible. They're taking the Chinese vaccines, which makes sense. They're available. They're using them. They do have some efficacy. They are helping, of course, but they are not the best vaccines. And I think it was also quite devastating, actually, and it was widely noticed in the region that China's top disease control official, Gao Fu, actually said publicly in April that the country's vaccines had low efficacy. He was then sat on very quickly and quickly said that he was misquoted. But it was pretty interesting that China's own top disease control official said that their vaccines were not very effective. So this is not sort of American propaganda. This is the Chinese themselves. The other thing I would say, we talked about the slightly double-edged sword that is Chinese vaccines, is also the double-edged sword that's vaccine diplomacy. Sergio, I think, has eloquently laid out the very productive and beneficial pragmatic relationship between Chile and China, founded on trade and diplomacy going back to 1970, which has been quite a smooth relationship, I think it's fair to say, and a productive one on both sides. But we've also seen very different sorts of China relationship in other Latin American countries. We've seen Brazil, where indeed, provocative remarks from the government, quite extreme remarks from the Bolsonaro clan, have led to slowdowns in supply, shall we say, from China of vaccines in recent weeks. And whatever you think about Bolsonaro and his political stance and his habit of shooting from the hip in his public comments, I think if you're an average Brazilian, you will not feel very happy that the Chinese not only put down your president in public, but they also apparently are slowing down on the supplies of critical ingredients, which is affecting the health and the lives of your own citizens. That's not something that leaves a very happy memory. In Peru, where I am now, I said I would mention briefly here, we had the vaccine scandal earlier this year, when there was the suspicion of bribery, and that's still being investigated to the best of my knowledge, but there were allegations of bribery in the signing of the contract with Sinopharm, and allegations that the bribery included free supplies of Sinopharm to VIPs. So again, not concluded yet, the investigations, but there's a taint of corruption, there's a taint of some quite unpleasant business going on there alongside the vaccine. It's not all a happy story. The final thing I would just say is that on the US side, the US at the moment doesn't look so good in the region in terms of vaccines because of the very limited supplies of US vaccines to the region. That will change. The US is obviously very advanced in its own vaccination program. Once the US is fully vaccinated, we can expect very substantial supplies of US vaccines starting to flow to Latin America. We know quite a lot of deals for those vaccines have already been supplied. So by the end of the year, we'll probably see a quite different picture where US vaccines are flowing to Latin America in much greater quantity. And the US is starting to look relatively much better. And of course, the US is, I think, underlining at the moment that its vaccine policies are not influenced by politics, in contrast to the Chinese ones. And my fellow panelists have rightly pointed out the Taiwan issue. I think that's the other one alongside what's happened in Brazil that shows, if you like, the claws of Chinese diplomacy as well as the charm. And again, I think if you're a Latin American government looking at this, you're not going to feel terribly happy that Paraguay was told that it should switch its diplomacy, that Guyana was told to close a trade office, that Honduras has not been able to secure a contract with Chinese vaccine suppliers, all because of their recognition of Taiwan. That there's an element there of bullying, and quite rightly was mentioned earlier by Margaret that this is a stark contrast to China's public position that they don't interfere in the internal politics of Latin American countries. That's clearly shown not to be the case in these instances which we've mentioned where there's a pressure on Taiwan. So there's also there, if you like, the possibility or the charge of hypocrisy sticking to the Chinese. So I think, in conclusion, I would just say this narrative is still being shaped. I think it will look quite significantly different in a few months' time. I think the US still has a great deal to play for in the region, and the narrative could look very different in a year's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that presentation and for giving us a general view of what has been so far the real impact of China related with the vaccination process, especially in Latin America. As you correctly said, most of our countries, at least Chile, most of the vaccines come from China. And I hope that they're efficient because I got the Chinese vaccine. So, but apart from that, also, you pointed correctly that the situation between one or other countries in Latin America is a bit different. And in terms of the relation that they have with China, you mentioned Paraguay, for example, that they have tightened their relations with Taiwan, and that has had an impact now with the vaccination process with China. And also you pointed very interestingly, what is going to happen with the US in terms of the vaccination process and the impact in Latin America. And I'm going to start with a question related to that is in the chat. That's from Ted Christ, that it says, what is the panel estimate of Latin American citizens, including Chileans, who have chosen to travel to the US for vaccinations? Will the respective countries include these citizens in vaccinated statistics? Will that support positive views of the USA vis-a-vis China? that's more or less related with what you just talked about, Michael. I don't know if you want to address that comment.
Sure, I'm happy to address it. It's clearly been a phenomenon. I think it fits into a long-term tradition, which is that Latin American citizens who have difficulty securing what they need at home tend to travel to the US for it. Now, in previous times, that was maybe electronics goods or computer gear or banking services. At the moment, it's vaccines. So in a sense, it's not something new. It is, of course, a small elite who can afford to do that. I don't think they will be counted in the numbers because most of the governments in the region are counting what they're vaccinating at home. They obviously can't count people vaccinated abroad. But I don't think it's going to have a significant impact on the whole sort of question of vaccine diplomacy and perceptions of countries. I think what it does actually more is just reinforce locally the sense of injustice and inequality, which has been fueled by the pandemic. And of course, people are just saying, oh, look, and yet another thing, the rich can afford to go and get vaccinated in America. And those of us who are not lucky enough to have a visa for the US or the money for a ticket can't go and get a vaccine. But I think that's the sort of limit of it in terms of impact.
Thank you very much, Michael. And there's another question. I'm going to merge two questions related to the origin of the vaccines from China, because Sergio mentioned that comes from companies in China, but as we all know, the private company in China is something very special. Normally, they're all related to the government. So what is behind this vaccination diplomacy? It's something interesting. And there's a question here. Would you say that this diplomacy of the vaccines from China, it's part of a general strategy to and related with soft power from China to the world, and specifically Latin America, that also includes the Belt and Road Initiative? Is this part of a whole thing, and they're taking advantage of the situation to cause an impact in the relations in Latin America, although we say that the vaccines come from private companies, but that's not always the case in terms of China. I don't know who wants to address this. I don't know if you, Margaret, or Sergio, or Michael.
I'm happy to take an initial stab at it. Others are welcome to do so as well. So yeah, I mean, the question of whether a company is, is state-owned or private or some sort of combination thereof, is something that comes up frequently in discussions about Chinese, engagement, whether in Latin America or other regions, and whether this in some form, informs these countries' respective motivations when engaging with these regions. In the case of I mean, what we often see, there are those companies that are clearly, state-owned enterprises. They operate very much in support of, for example, the tenets of the going out strategy. They receive financing in support of their, their overseas engagement, usually in reference, in association with the Belt and Road Initiative in various forms, right? There are those also that are, are fully private. Huawei is one of these, right? A lot of the other tech companies are as well, and indeed these pharmaceutical companies are. But of course, private. They may be private. They have a wide range of stakeholders. They're often, operating according to sort of, motivations, private sector type motivations, and profit-based motivations rather. But receive quite a bit of support from the Chinese government in the way of subsidies, tax breaks, other things that enable them to be able to engage more extensively overseas. They also receive a lot of support from various funds, from the establishment, governmental and quasi-governmental establishment in China that operates at various administrative levels and helps these companies to strike deals. And so, yeah, I mean, regardless, there is a tremendous deal of support, I think, for a lot of these companies. With respect to pharmaceuticals companies in particular, they are indeed part of what is called the Health Silk Road, right? Which is a sort of extension of, or related to, at the very least, the Belt and Road Initiative. Another one of these sort of Belt and Road Initiative extensions that's quite, quite important in the Latin American region and wide-ranging other regions is the digital Silk Road, right? And we're seeing a lot of activity in the digital space as well, and will continue during the pandemic, certainly, and that will continue to be a feature of Chinese engagement afterward. And to the extent that they are involved in the Health Silk Road, which is wide-ranging, right? It's not just about pharmaceuticals, but about, the introduction of biomedical technologies, of, AI-based diagnostic capabilities, things of this nature that Chinese companies of various sorts, tech companies, pharmaceuticals companies, others, biomedical companies have had the opportunity to indeed introduce amid the pandemic. This has been a unique opportunity to showcase some of China's capabilities in this particular sector. And so I do think, there are wide-ranging reasons why China is engaging the region through COVID-19 diplomacy. I think the most important one, especially at the onset of the pandemic, was to shape views of China, to make sure that China emerged from this crisis with its, image more or less untarnished, right? Especially as it was facing a lot of criticism globally, certainly from the Trump administration, but also across Latin America for its, the possibility of its role in the pandemic. And so, whether rightly or not, and so I think, in general, it's absolutely the case that these companies, have that interest, particular interest in mind, but also commercial ones, as we've seen, again, showcasing these technologies. And then for China more broadly, as Michael pointed out, as I mentioned in my comments, there are other sort of, policy related, especially as concerns Taiwan, but other policy related interests that are being supported by a lot of what China is trying to do. And much of this, again, is an effort, I think, just to strengthen bilateral ties, to demonstrate that, China is indeed a partner that countries can rely upon. And we'll see, right? As Michael mentioned, this is a rapidly evolving scenario, but we'll see if this indeed, has the intended effect of all of this outreach, has the intended effect in all of these different spheres. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Do you want to add something to that, Michael? Because you said that regardless of the efforts that China is trying to make here in Latin America, at least from the public opinion, there's no relation to China whatsoever in what has to do with the vaccine. No one talks about China or the Chinese vaccines. In Chile, that's true, definitely.
I think Margaret explained very well the sort of nature of Chinese company participation and how it fits into the broader aims of the Silk Road. I would just say that I think it will look very different in a year's time, and that what will count for more and is much more important as a sort of long-term consequence in the countries are things like investment and ownership and loans, and of course, and trade. And there, indeed, China has been growing too, very rapidly, as we know, over the last 2 decades, and the dialogue has done some excellent work with Margaret's initiative in charting the shape of that relationship and how it's evolved. And there are now some Latin American countries whose main trade relationship is with China. Chile, of course, is first among them. Brazil is another. But when we look at investment, the picture is a little different. And if I'm not mistaken, the total stock of foreign investment by the US is still far bigger in Latin America than China. So China is starting to catch up, but it's still a very, very long way from being the biggest investor in Latin America. And I think, again, that's easy to forget. And we've seen now quite a big effort being made on the US side to not lose the position it has in Latin America and to make sure investment is funneled to Latin America. The Inter-American Development Bank has been very active and very vocal on that topic, but others too within the Biden administration recognize privately the need to make sure that the US does not lose out. So I think those things, actually, the longer term investment and trade relationship are likely to be much more significant for shaping the relationship between the US and Latin America, or China and Latin America, than the vaccines, which I would regard at the moment as a bit of a sort of temporary phenomenon. It's the enormous issue of the moment, but for reasons I explained earlier, I think will be much less of an issue in a year or two's time.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Loreto, could I just add one more point, and not to refute anything that Michael said, but just one thing that I do wonder about, and that I think we ought to keep an eye on, is the extent to which, again, some of these these company level ties, right, that are being established through transfers of PPE initially, right, but then also, now, broader vaccine diplomacy may indeed sort of pay off, right, in the future as Chinese companies pursue new commercial opportunities. I don't think it will be a revolution, change things considerably, the overall dynamic, but I do think that some of this targeted assistance will be could be quite productive, especially, some of it, and reinforces a lot of the networks that China has been developing over the course of the past 5 years in particular, but even longer at the local level, right, in the Latin American region with municipalities and other, and a lot of that, I mean, has been really quite productive already in terms of, facilitating commercial deal making. So I wonder, it's, again, the jury's out, but it will be interesting to see whether that indeed does pay off, at least at the firm level.
Thank you. Yes, Sergio, go ahead, por favor.
I just wanted to say that I agree with the idea that this is a passing phenomenon. We should concentrate more on the trends. And on the trends, of course, the US and Europe are have much larger investments in the region. China is just beginning. But if we look at the trends, we should consider that the displacement of power to the Pacific will continue. So the rate of growth, because it's starting from a lower level, would be larger, higher in the case of Asia in general and China in particular. So if you put yourself in the feet of the Latin Americans, it's a major importance to be involved in the Pacific and Asia and to see how to move ahead. Now, the first thing is that you shouldn't consider China just as a unit, a central government, a Chinese Communist Party that is controlling everything. I think we have to analyze better and understand better the narrative of the Chinese, what is going on inside, how are their politics outside. But what I think Latin America should avoid being managed intellectually in terms of the logic of the rivalry, strategic rivalry with the United States. That will reduce our space for movement, and that's against our interests. For instance, the example that Michael gave about the cars, I would prefer a BMW. But if I am dying before, I have to use any car. And when Trump was there, Chile didn't have other options, and we moved. I am vaccinated twice with the Chinese vaccine. I think it's provoking a positive effect on the country. So the problem with the conflict US-China is very relevant for Latin Americans in the sense that we have to push for a more multilateral, multipolar system. And in that sense, I think that our strategy should combine also with the Europeans in trying to avoid simplifications that reduces our objectives. Now, the US, if you look at that after the Trump administration, you would see that, well, there is the risk that is perceived by the Asians of the paralyzation and the polarization of the US political system. So the capacity to move ahead, it's lower. And so a major problem in the future would be democracy and the capacity for democracy to deliver vis-a-vis an authoritarian system to deliver. So that's a trend, and we have to be aware of that. Now, how democracy could become more efficient and to have a good governance, global and local, I think it would be an important topic for the future beyond the pandemic, and especially on the US. Just to finish, we should reinforce Latin American relation with the US. Now, what? Digital developments and technology investments. That's one. Green, but it's slow today. We don't see that. Chile, for instance, just bought a series of buses, electric buses from China. So, and that has to do with our movement towards renewable energy. So stronger position of the US vis-a-vis Latin America on these two areas, I think it's important. The same concerning democracy and human rights. We are having this year the Summit of the Americas, 2021. And we have this year the 20th anniversary of the Charter of Democracy. So there are areas where also we can push together and enhance our democratic values that play a major role in what we are discussing now. But I think we have to improve our knowledge of China in order to act and to avoid bipolar approach and to see how the US will react to that. And finally, the Latin Americans. Of course, if we are just passive, as it is now, it's a pity what was the situation of Latin America. We cannot react. But if we have a policy, if we approach China in a different way and see if they are not just, as somebody says, a predatory economic power, but also we can negotiate some issues on development and technology in Latin America, I think that can change also the picture. But I think we should keep our autonomy as Latin Americans in this big conflict, larger conflict, in order to move ahead and come out of this crisis. This crisis that we're having now is a major one that may take not only 1 year, but 5 years or a decade to get out. And the Chinese should play a role now. What role is something that we have to continue development, and with the help of Margaret, I think we will much more intelligence to face this kind of competition and challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Relating this relation of Latin America with the US and China, there's a question that has to do with Australia. That says that Australia is facing a high degree of economic coercion from China through sudden use of swift trade restrictions in multiple sectors. Iron ore trade affects both Australia and potentially Brazil. Will this might be used against US-friendly Latin American countries? I don't know who wants to address this question.
Let me just add to what I said before. Australia is a major case that we Latin Americans must look at with lots of care, because we have seen there, it's a reaction from the Chinese government when the Australians moved ahead in terms of investigating the origin of the virus and the issue of the sea, the China Sea. And what I've seen the number is that they have reduced the import of copper from Australia in a major proportion. And they have come and buying more from other places. Of barley, they reduced strongly the imports of barley and meat, and wine. So that's not easy. That's why I think that at least my country and Latin America in general, we have to be very careful about the proportion of our goods that are exported to China in order to avoid being too dependent from that. So I think Australia is a very important case to have in mind.
If I might add just something to what Sergio said, Lore, I fully agree that if you're sitting in Latin America, it makes sense to try to avoid being caught in a strategic rivalry between the US and China, to avoid picking sides. And that would always be a diplomatic recommendation for any smaller player caught between two big ones. I spent time in Moscow, and the former Soviet republics in Central Asia were masters at playing the sort of Moscow against Beijing against the US. It was a sort of triangular relationship. And Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan was a genius at doing this, and Kazakhstan prospered as it played off all three against each other. So, of course, that makes sense as a strategy. My view is that the problem, though, is that I predict you will see an increasingly sharp confrontation between the US and China over the next few years. And when that happens, I'm afraid there are moments when you don't have a choice. However much you may wish to avoid being drawn into that confrontation, you do actually have to make some decisions as a Latin American government. One of them, for example, on 5G. You know, do you allow Chinese companies to supply your 5G network or not? you can't have it both ways. You can't sort of say, yes, we will, and no, we won't at the same time, right? You have to come down on one side of the fence. And depending what you decide, either the Americans or the Chinese will be upset with you. So I think there will be more choices like that for Latin American governments, however much they wish to avoid them. And we all agree they should try to avoid them. They have no interest in a greater confrontation. Inevitably, they will have to choose on some occasions between one side or the other. But I think the other point, which is in a way almost more significant, to pick up also on what Sergio was saying, was when he was talking about how Latin America shouldn't be passive. And I think as the vaccine narrative in the next year will give way to an investment narrative and to the region's desperate need for investment to build and recover out of the pandemic and to develop a more green and sustainable, prosperous future, in looking for that investment, that money, which will be so badly needed, both from multilaterals and the private sector, that's really totally up to Latin America and to Latin American policymakers to make their countries attractive countries for that investment and to create frameworks that foreign investors will want to play in and to create opportunities that foreign investors will want to take advantage of. That's nothing to do with the Chinese or the US. That's entirely in Latin America's hands. And I think those of us who watch the region would have to say we do feel some concern that developments in the political scene over the past year have not been terribly supportive in some countries towards a better trade and investment framework for Latin America. A welcome exception was Ecuador, and I think we've seen from Guillermo Lasso a sensible commitment to try to make Ecuador a very attractive place for foreign investors to come in and to try and draw some of that money. But we need more governments in the region, in my view, to be thinking like that about how they can attract trade and investment. And as Sergio says, not to be passive, to remember that they have enormous ability to affect the outcome here.
Loreto, could I add one very quick point? Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with both of the other panelists' comments. I would just point out that there is some precedent for this, right? There was a moment when Argentina, which was looking to ship soy to Brazil, brought up a case against Brazil in the WTO, or rather, excuse me, soy to China, right, brought up a case against China in the WTO. And then as a result of that, the Chinese government rejected some shipments of soy to China. It was later purchased by India, but nevertheless, we do see, I mean, there are these very limited cases. Again, they are very limited to date. And that's why I mentioned, in my commentary that this sort of, leverage vis-a-vis Taiwan and Taiwan-related policy in the region, this non-interference narrative that's been, a major part of Chinese foreign policy for many, many years. A challenge for Latin America, I think, will be to determine where the red lines are, right, for the U.S. and for China as concerns their respective decision making, and that's very challenging because it seems to differ on a country by country basis, right? I mean, Australia has taken a very hard line toward China, certainly much more so than any of the countries in Latin America. But Brazil has also, the Brazilian president in particular, his remarks about China have been really quite bombastic, right? And so, to what extent is China willing to tolerate that? And, is there a sort of line that has yet to be crossed that would, result in some sort of punitive measure? Today, no, right? I mean, and in fact, the Brazil-China relationship has grown, in my view, at least under Bolsonaro, in many really sort of important ways. And at least in an economic sense, right? And then for the U.S., I mean, really the red line so far, I mean, the very clear one is Taiwan, right? I mean, Taiwan is an issue that still strikes a chord, and I think would with the Biden administration as well, if we were to see some real movement. And indeed, we've already seen this sort of flirting, right, with the notion of more extensive relationship with China among the government in Honduras. But where are these red lines going to fall? How much are they, shifting over time, and how do they differ on a country by country basis? This is a really critical question.
On the red lines, let me add a few things. I think there are red lines, and we should have to start thinking on that. Starting from the point that Latin America belongs to the West. So I think that's out of the question. Given that, what's our autonomy? Because if we act as Pompeo when he came to the Latin America was requiring that we stop investment from China, that's stupid. We are not going to do that. could be against our interests. But there are other red lines. For instance, in addition to Australia, that we have to look at that very particularly, we have to look at New Zealand and the Five Eyes system of where they were going to participate. I don't know where are they now. On the issue of political interference of internal affairs of Latin America, that's another red line. Risks of corruption when you have state-to-state things and you don't pass through rules. We have to be very stronger on rules for competition and concesiones and licitaciones that we have. And then the military presence and the capacity to defend our national resources that happened with fishing recently in the South Pacific coast. So those are things that we have to be aware. At the same time, we have to explore new opportunities there. Probably we have to send more Latin Americans to China. I was suggesting in Chile that those companies that are investing here also accept Chileans or Latin Americans to be their companies there. So we understand better what they are doing, what they want to develop in the future. So this space we have to explore more, and that will need coordination between Latin Americans that we don't have. We have never had a discussion in Latin Americans how to deal with China and the US, how to move, how to have space. And the G20 also would be an important space to express this possibility when if Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, who are members of that, could coordinate themselves and also ask the rest of Latin America. So I agree that there is a lot to do from the Latin American side and not stay passive, as Michael pointed before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio, and thank you very much, Margaret and Michael, for all the comments regarding the question. There is one coming from Beatriz Rangel for Michael. It says, which countries in Latin America you think will be prime targets for deployment of a US nearshoring strategy, if there is one?
Thank you. Yes, well, nearshoring is certainly a big buzzword in the pandemic. The obvious beneficiary is Mexico, and I think we will see Mexico benefiting, although the government there perhaps has not done all that it could do to take advantage of that opportunity, but the private sector certainly is seeing that opportunity and doing what it can. Central America, to some extent, could benefit also. It's got the CAFTA deal with the US. Colombia would very much like to benefit, and there's a government strategy around trying to benefit from nearshoring, but Colombia suffers the simple fact that it's geographically more distant from the US and doesn't have quite the same trade access. But I think those would probably be the main ones.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. There's another question that it's in Spanish coming from Carlos Portales, former General Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. It says, en el enfrentamiento de la pandemia, obtención de máscaras y respiradores primero y de vacunas después, lo que ha funcionado ha sido la política nacional que ha logrado comprar vacunas en China, no necesariamente por un acuerdo con el gobierno chino, y la mencionada relación entre universidades chilenas y entidades chinas, pero no ha habido ninguna política regional. Si eso es así, dos preguntas. ¿Qué posibilidades existen que en el mediano plazo exista tal política? ¿No será tan o más importante que lo anterior profundizar cómo tener políticas nacionales más afinadas, no solo teniendo en cuenta lo que ha pasado, sino realidades como las señaladas por Michael Stott, de una mayor disponibilidad de vacunas y la necesidad de tener un mínimo nacional de producción de ciertos elementos básicos?
Bueno, me alegro que Carlos esté presente, porque son discusiones que tenemos. Yo coincido con él, de que se requiere una política mucho más precisa de cada país y una más alta coordinación de América Latina. Yo hoy día no la veo, pero está surgiendo una presión creciente por una coordinación latinoamericana, no solo en esto, en otras cosas, incluso en materia de salud, en materia de finanzas internacionales, y otros temas como estos. Pero yo no quería dejar de decir también el tema de la política china en Venezuela y de aclarar también, en la medida que Venezuela tenga una posición más clara y fuerte y común, no dispersa como hoy incluso a través del Grupo de Lima y el Grupo de Contacto, tener una postura más firme sobre el fortalecimiento de la democracia y la posición de América Latina también respecto a las conversaciones con China sobre la democracia en Venezuela. A propósito de lo que antes se preguntaba por Beatriz. Me parece que ese es un punto bastante importante también de la política a considerar en las coordinaciones latinoamericanas frente a China.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And indeed, there's another question regarding China's engagement with the Venezuela regime. It says explicit or indirect, no? What's the potential US involvement? And it mentions Belarus episode in context. This is Pablo Breard who's making the question. I don't know if any of you would like to address it.
I could say a few quick things on that, just that I think it's striking that although Venezuela is an ally of China, it did not receive large quantities of Chinese vaccines. In fact, I think it received almost no Chinese vaccines, if I remember correctly, which was interesting. And it's also not received significant Chinese loans for several years now. So the Chinese pragmatism, which we see often operating in the relationships with Latin American countries, would appear to dictate that Venezuela is not economically strong enough to be worth dealing with in a major way, either in vaccines or in loans at the moment, which I think is quite interesting and opens an opportunity, if the US wanted to take advantage of it, for the US to try to gain greater leverage in Venezuela in the political process, perhaps through some vaccine diplomacy of its own, perhaps. That's just a thought on that. I would also just like to add to what Sergio said. I do think the lack of regional coordination is a huge issue in Latin America. He was quite right to mention it, and is something that cries out to be addressed. It's very striking that you have things like the Africa Union, which are very effective regional forums, the GCC for the Gulf, you have ASEAN in Asia. There's really no functioning body like that in Latin America. And I think perhaps the way to do it, the way that one might suggest is to recreate that Clinton idea of the free trade area of the Americas. I think if the US is looking for a big policy initiative, thinking of that summit which is coming up, the one that would appear to be one of the most productive and obvious to go for is to try to revive that Clinton era 1990s free trade area of the Americas. It might be wishful thinking. I know the Democrats are not keen on new trade deals, but that would be a really clear statement about what the US wants to do with the region in the future in terms of creating a really open, productive relationship based on trade and business and providing a constructive alternative to increasing dependence on China, which, as Sergio says quite rightly, one has to watch the degree of dependence and avoid overdependence. But I think if the US wanted something constructive rather than criticism or pressure, offering a big free trade area of the Americas would be an amazing way to achieve that, even if it's frankly not that likely to happen. Thank you.
Indeed, Michael, it seems a bit difficult to foresee something happening in the near future, unfortunately. Well, we have reached the time that we settled for this webinar, but before that, I wanted to take some of your words, Michael, when you talked about how important is going to be what the Chinese investments and trade investment from China in Latin America and the implication that it has. Our next webinar that we're going to hold together with the Inter-American Dialogue again will be Decoding Chinese Investment in Latin America. So we'll leave you invited to all of you to participate. We're going to have high-level panelists as well, as always. And I would just like to thank you, the three of you, Margaret, Michael, and Sergio, for this very interesting webinar. And we remain grateful to you, and we hope to have you again in a future event of the Foundation, and hopefully with the Inter-American Dialogue again. So thank you so much, and have a very nice day.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Much.
Now, Margaret.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye,
Ciao.
Mike. Ciao,
Bye, Sergio.